So, hello and welcome. I'm going to introduce Sanja Bonic, which is going to talk about clean desktop and containerizing it.
So, we have a lot of people here. Thanks all for coming, even though yesterday was probably a lot more interesting. So today is you want a clean desktop, containerize it. I got the talk idea before I joined Red Hat. I'm now a community lead for Atomic. And I actually submitted the talk because I was a huge Gen 2 fan. I was using it exclusively for many, many years. And I reinstalled it a lot of times because of, when you install dependencies and you have many things that you want in a dev environment, you end up with a lot of unnecessary packages. And then when you deep clean it, something always breaks. So I was really, really getting angry at that. And then I saw Jessie Frizzell's post about how she uses CoreOS as a desktop. So I figured maybe there's some other ContainerOSs around. And yeah, Atomic was there, obviously. I'm now working with the team. And when I submitted the talk, I didn't know that there is actually an Atomic workstation also. So when you want to use Atomic Host as your desktop OS, it works too, but it needs a lot of steps. And since I was here, I also found the actual initial developer of Atomic Workstation. This is why we switched, and he's going to give the talk today. I give the similar talk again at FOSDEM. It's going to be me. But we have actually Colin Walters here today, so he's going to give the talk and some insight into Atomic Workstation.
All right, cool, thanks. So it turns out there's a lot of interest in Atomic in general, but specifically Atomic Workstation here at DevConf. And I gotta say, I just love going to this conference. It's really energizing being able to talk to you, all of you guys, and interact with you. So there's actually a whole lot of different components here. And when people talk about Atomic, they usually think about Atomic Host. Project Atomic is really focused on containerization. And since there are 2 other talks about Atomic Workstation today, which if you're interested and you should go to, they cover different things. What I wanted to drill down a little bit to is how you containerize command line tools. So we'll get into that. But Project Atomic, we really want to get you into containers because they have a lot of advantages. And I'm going to talk about, a little bit about this in my talk too, about the RPMOS tree layer 3 today. But so obviously we start out with Atomic Host, and how does that apply to the desktop, right? And so what I want to look at today is how do containers, modern containers, help me develop, right? So we have Fedora Workstation, right, with this implicit idea, well, not implicit, explicit, that you are using it to create something, to make, right? It's not like an iPhone or something where it's just about consumption, in my opinion, right? Like we're trying to have you be a maker, right? So what can I containerize? How do I do it? That's kind of the things we're going to be talking about. And obviously there's a lot of buzz around container-focused operating systems, right? You hear a lot about these. That's obviously what the Project Atomic Host is. So Atomic Host has been around for quite a long time now. And I should definitely emphasize, Project Atomic is not something it's a project, it's a community that spans our other communities of Fedora, CentOS, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So the Project Atomic Workstation is not actually something you get. You actually get Fedora Atomic Workstation. Maybe down the line there will be other distribution brands. But right now today there's CentOS Atomic Host, Fedora Atomic Host, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux Atomic Host. So on the server side, that all exists. And so one of the key things is that we're not trying to create something distinct from the distribution itself. There's no secret sauce. It's just built from the distribution RPM content. So a lot of people compare Atomic Host to CoreOS. It's relatively valid. There's a lot of overlap in where we're going. There's a lot of differences too. And again, if you're interested in this part, this is going to be my talk at 3. So what we're going to focus on today, though, is, to me, Atomic Workstation is not taking something like CoreOS, a server OS, and using Docker for desktop apps and stuff. I think we have a different approach. And how many people here have heard of KubeOS? Not, okay, a number. I gotta say, they're doing really interesting stuff. You know, a lot of stuff in the distribution space is somewhat derivative and boring. Kubes is focused on the desktop, and they have really strong isolation using Vert. So they have a really strong story, and I think a lot of the endorsements you'll see in their page are valid. So at a high level, I think what we're focusing on with Project Atomic, though, is containerization, which is orthogonal to virtualization. So right now, you can use containers and get pretty good security. Down the line, I'd like to have something a little bit more like Kubes has, where it's run this app in a VM, take a lot of their DNA into this. But I think but the Vert approach is very heavyweight. So I have Kubes on a spare laptop. It's very heavyweight. Containers are easier. So, you know, Microsoft spent a lot of effort introducing the Windows Bash shell, right? Because the thing is, there's so much Unix software out there, like Git, for example, that just, I mean, they did it for an obvious reason, right? A lot of people used OS X because, you know, it's Unix, most stuff was compatible. But it's interesting, of course, because on OS X you have Homebrew or something that's distinct from the operating system. So why would we try and containerize our desktop, right? Like, I see a lot of ThinkPads and stuff like that. So I'm assuming most people are running Linux on their desktop here, maybe. So why would you abandon the package manager, right? Well, you're not quite abandoning it, but I'll get there. So one of the key things is around security, right? The most important stuff to keep up to date on your desktop system is your kernel, your browser, right? I mean, there's been so many months where there's a remote code execution flaw in Firefox and a local exploit in the kernel. And there you go. It's just a 1-2 punch from a website to full control of your laptop, right? You need to keep your host operating system up to date, right? And if you have just like a whole bunch of development tools mixed in your root file system, that's all the stuff that needs to be updated in one gigantic slow transaction before you actually get Firefox updated, right? It's more important to keep your desktop up to date than it is to keep your development tools up to date. It's one of the arguments here. And also, of course, containers allow isolation. So for those of you who've been using package managers for your root file system for a long time, like I had until I made a hybrid, I'm sure you've had at least one package management disaster in your life. Now, obviously, distributions vary, but, you know, it's really easy when you start mixing in third-party repositories, you know. You get some like crazy dep solve error, and you just, you know, it's like, screw it. I'm using OS X or whatever, right? So you don't, by containerizing your desktop, treating it a little bit more like a Chromebook or a Windows machine or something like without a package manager a little bit, you make it easier to keep it up to date. Like, isolate your development and your desktop stuff. So this talk is not going to be about the desktop app side of it. Alex talked about Flatpak. And one of the interesting things he mentioned in his talk is that Flatpak's not about command line apps, right? It's not about if you find some new command line note-taking thing. That's not what Flatpak's about. So you can do this, but again, that's not what the talk's about. So this pattern doesn't have a name, and I think a lot of people do it in different ways. And actually, there was a great talk yesterday from Jan about this. It's really funny because he had a really different approach. But the basic idea is these dev or pet containers, as I call them, you use package managers inside them. Like traditional package managers work great inside a container, right? So this is an example from my Docker file. Now, I use Docker today for a couple reasons. Well, I also use nspawn and bubble wrap sometimes too. I won't go into all this. We're trying not to tie ourselves to one container technology, but Docker is very popular, and it's also a requirement of OC cluster up. So anyways, so you can see here I'm enabling documentation because I like to have my man pages in my container because our base container turns off documentation. And I just, you know, install a whole bunch of development stuff in there. And this is actually where it's really different from the talk yesterday. So I have one big container with all my development tools rather than trying to make a container per command line app because that just seems a lot harder. So here's the thing, key dividing point between containers and virtualization. I'm sure a lot of you have used Vagrant, or maybe you use libvirt and you like SSH in to copy files around and stuff. The beautiful thing about using containers is it's the same kernel, so you can just copy files back and forth, and it just works, right? So the way I set up my development environment is I chose /srv is the exchange point between my host and my containers, right? So it's basically where I keep my Git repositories, which is distinct from my home directory. Now, obviously, this whole thing is wildly flexible. You can do whatever you want. I just chose to use /srv because, I don't know, it works. And because we're Fedora, CentOS, Red Enterprise Linux, you will have to set the SE Linux labels correctly. And this is something where down the line, we might start getting opinionated about this type of stuff. Anyways, and you can see my Docker file, and you can see where I set up a bind mount between the host /srv and my container. And I actually run tmux inside the container, so it's easier to have multiple shells. Use net equals host to share the host network namespace. So if I want to like spin up a temporary web server, you know, to bind to port 8000, it just binds to my host because it's kind of what I want for this development flow. And then in the atomic command interprets this label run. So when I type atomic run CG Walters fdev, it basically enters my container, spawns tmux, and that's my dev environment. So I constantly, so this is the trade-off versus what Jan's approach was. I am constantly switching between my host terminal and my dev environment terminal. And I found it makes things a lot easier. So I use GNOME terminal profiles and actually have systemd user units to spawn the terminals. So I guess I can show you, but basically I just have an orange profile for my container and a white orange background for my dev container, white background for my host, because it just helps in keeping things separate. I mean, obviously there's a ton of solutions to this, but that's what helped me. So really good example of where to dive into this, right? If you want to develop server apps, you can run OC cluster up locally, and you know, you get a full Kubernetes cluster locally. It's awesome, right? Like Kubernetes is very much about services. Kubernetes is very opinionated about this, and if you get into that model, it's awesome. Like it really is, and obviously it's huge, and the community is amazing, all that stuff. But not everything is a service, right? So a good example is I want to test a new version of the Git command line, right? Git is not a web service, right? It just doesn't fit in the Kubernetes model at all, right? So yeah, I mean, I could use OC build to like create a new Git container and then RSH into it, but it'd just be totally weird. And obviously, I don't tend to pull images from the Docker Hub. That's a whole other topic. So yeah, would I just rebase my whole host system to Fedora Rawhide? Obviously insane, right? Should you spawn a Rawhide virtual machine? Well, sure. You know, you can. That's the old school way to do it, right? Yeah, obviously there's modularity, which is all about multiple versions. I'm not going to talk too much about that. When you start to use containers to test things, everything just gets better than using VMs, right? So in my dev container, I can actually just easily copy it, use yum install, enable repo rawhide to pull that down, or obviously, let's just build Git from Git master, right? I sudo make install into my dev container, right? It doesn't affect my host. My host stays stable. That version of Git is, if you're using rpm-ostree for it, it's immutable, right? Like I have, you know, it's solid. But I can actually use it, right? And this is something that would be really painful in KubeOS, right? Because you just, I don't know, the virtualization layer is a lot heavier. So here's a really good example of I want to develop on the host user space. So this is me. I'm an operating system developer, right? Which is very different from someone who's writing, you know, a web server or a database or something like that. I mean, well, sometimes you have to drill down into the stack and actually fix things. But, you know, so actually I have contributed to all of those projects at the top list and a bunch. Yeah, I like contributing to user space stuff. So here's my new flow. In my dev container, well, right now I used to sometimes generate RPMs, but it's actually really annoying to do that because you generate an RPM which is compressed, and then you take it to the host which immediately uncompresses it, and it's just a little silly, I guess. So what I actually tend to do more often is use make install dester equivalent. Like basically you just get the new files you want to overlay on the host, right? So that I'm in my orange dev container, right, at this point. And then I context switch to the host system, right? So one of the cool things about the rpm-ostree stack is we actually have this unlock command, which is basically mounts an overlay FS, so the changes only last for this boot. So if you want to undo, you can just reboot. If you're using Yum or apt or one of those things, you can find a different solution for like how you snapshot the host root or manage it. But yeah, then on the host, it's just, let me just overlay these files, right? So that way I have, again, I don't have GCC, I don't have make on my host root file system. Actually, I do have make right now because of the dependency of OpenSSL, which I fixed in Fedora, so hopefully make will drop out of the root file system. Yeah, I mean, and obviously, containers are not mutually exclusive with virtualization. All the tools that you're used to with virtualization still make sense. So, when I'm hacking in the RPM tree stack, which is really about managing the host file system, I tend to build in a container and then sync to a virtual machine, right? So I'm actually involving all three of those every day. Sometimes it gets a little confusing, but it actually works pretty well, right? Because then I treat my VMs as disposable. Like I don't install my devel tools in there, which just makes everything easier, in my opinion. So yeah, how much time do I have left, by the way? Who's 5 minutes? Oh, okay. All right, so downsides. Yeah, obviously, you now have two things at least that you have to keep updated, right? And we're kind of working on addressing this on the host RPM tree side with automatic updates, and we're going to make that really nice. And I actually thought about like having RPM-specific things to like build my containers. But then the problem is, as an upstream developer of OSTree, I still need my software to work on Ubuntu. So it, like, I have a dev container for Ubuntu too, right? And so it's just tricky, right? Like I can make things more RPM specific, but the more RPM specific I make, the less my workflow works for Ubuntu. So it's just like this constant tension. Yeah, and I'm out of time. Yeah, context switching a lot. Yeah, security is hard. I'm not claiming there's a lot of, you can do containers secure, but that's it. Anyways, let's collaborate. I think a lot of people are doing stuff like this. Just post what you're doing to Atomic Devel. Like, let's talk about it, right? Let's collaborate. And yeah, I'd love to see like someone own a project around this. Yep, that's it. Yeah, are there any questions? Yep.
Having lived this experience, the only real hardship I found with it was getting the editor coordinated, getting a graphical tool without compromising security.
Oh, okay, right. So Dan's comment was he found it, yeah, if you run a GUI app from your container, you basically compromise security. Unfortunately, I mean, the same is true of Flatpak today. Like the problem is we're trying to get on a path where we can secure GUI apps, but I gave a talk at the SE Linux conference in 2004 right about this. I mean, this is a hard problem and we haven't made big strides on it beyond doing the Kubes approach of let's just slap a VM around the whole thing, right? But then you make it harder to get data in and out, right? There's no magic bullet for the security. Like I said, I'd love to make the vert path easier. That's another thing like I just love to see people talk about. But I feel like too many of us just default to, okay, I want this app, I'm just going to yum install it on my root file system, right? Just moving away from that mental model, just take that first step, and I think we can start to collaborate on these tools, right? And actually, it doesn't mean you can't install stuff on your root file system. Just don't default to it, right? Or try not to. Yeah. Any other questions? Yep, Mark. Right. Yeah, so just to briefly restate that, so basically what Martin ran into is if you want to have service, you're developing a service that you want to expose to the host, right? I think the short answer is I personally just do the rsync to host model. Like, so I leave my host unlocked and develop it there because for exactly those problems, I So yeah, because my container doesn't share, I don't have the host root file system mounted. I don't leak the dbus socket because if you start doing that, things get really dangerous. Like yum in the container, there's like a systemd plugin inhibit that will try and talk to systemd. And so if you somehow get that systemd socket in your container, like your container's yum update will like affect your host and everything gets bad. So so I try and keep them isolated, and basically I just don't do that, I guess. I think down the line, we do want to make it nicer to like spin up a kind of system container that has that root file system, but is integrated with the host a little bit. It's just, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Let's say that we have a proper way to work around CDDL issue with GPL. I mean the ZFS right now, say I have in mind. In form of wrapper providing, for example, dbus interface to manipulate the ZFS. How do you think community as a whole would be willing to start incorporating ZFS functionality into the whole workflow?
Into like the container stack? So you're thinking like underneath my dev container or something, like snapshots of that? Or so the question was around ZFS. I'm not a ZFS expert. I personally find overlayFS is pretty good for my use case. But you know, as far as the community, I mean, this is part of why Fedora exists. I mean, it was just in the talk earlier. You know, if for people who are interested in that, you can try and drive it in the Fedora community. But personally, I mean, yeah, overlayFS has been working for me, I guess. So, yeah.
There is a ZFS.
Yeah, right now there is ZFS with container storage, for example, which is pulled from the Docker Mobi, but it's only exactly the ZFS tools directly. It's not linked to the linked ZFS, which tends to break.
Everything comes down to the ZFS.
Yeah, but when you, for example, have a service that provides that link directly to the ZFS, but you and you have a clean programmable interface, and you don't have to parse the ZFS tools that tends to change slightly.
We should probably take this one to the list, I think. We're almost at time. It's,
We'll move this
yeah.
discuss this on.
Yeah, I'm going to contribute to the working group and stuff. Just come to the Atomic IRC channel. Welcome, contributions are welcome. Also, we have Slack here. So.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool. All right, thanks all.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. So grab a t-shirt if you want one, basically. They're free.